This is part 3 of the three-part series titled Something Old, Something New: The Criminal Enslavement of 500,000 Black Colonials and Afrofuturism in the 21st Century by Larry Kenneth Alexander. Afrofuturism and Imagining New American Slavery Alternatives in the 21st Century. The 500,000 Black colonials who were wrongly enslaved in 1776 and whose descendants became the cornerstone of America's slave-based economy by 1783, are the true foundational Black Americans. Their forced labor built not only the White House, the U.S. Capitol, and Georgetown University, but also shaped the very foundation of early America's economic and political systems. Some argue that distinguishing foundational Black Americans from other Black groups risks fracturing the broader Black community. But this recognition is not about division, it is about historical accuracy. This rediscovery of American history is essential to correcting revisionist historiography, and Afrofuturism plays a crucial role in this process. Afrofuturism's power lies in its fusion of historical rediscovery, political speculation, and the imaginative reconfiguration of legal and political structures that could have altered the course of the African diaspora. The legal justifications for slavery, segregation, and systemic racism in the U.S. were built on deliberate distortions of Black legal rights during colonial times. Afrofuturism challenges these foundations by exploring alternative legal histories. What if the British imperial government had protected Black agency from the outset? What if colonial and early American leaders had upheld Black sovereignty rather than sacrificing it to preserve national unity in 1783? One striking example is Afrofuturism's interrogation of the enslavement of 500,000 Black colonials following the Treaty of Paris, 1783. While the United States pledged to set at liberty all Englishmen, it simultaneously enslaved legally free Black Englishmen, flagrantly violating both the rule of law and international norms. This moment is central to understanding the legal and actual status of foundational Black Americans and the contradictions upon which America was built. Afrofuturism compels us to reimagine an alternative legal reality, one where British imperial law protected the rights of Black colonials, recognizing their agency and affirming the illegality of their enslavement. It provides a lens through which historical injustices are not only critiqued, but re-envisioned. Through speculative narratives, Afrofuturism fosters debate, shapes policy discussions, and drives intellectual discourse, transforming history from a static record into a dynamic battleground for justice. Afrofuturism contemplates and enables the imagination of a legal and proper beginning for American slavery. However, with the passage of time, England's Court of King's Bench, its highest court, came to declare colonial slave codes and Negro laws in the American colonies unlawful, in the absence of explicit legal authority, which did not exist in English common law. In Somerset v. Stewart, 1772, this High Court established a controlling precedent by ruling slavery was an odious practice, unsupported by English law, and required an explicit positive law to be legal in the kingdom. This Afrofuturistic narrative suggests that the 500,000 Black colonials residing in America's 13 colonies when the American Patriots declared independence in 1776 were, by law, free individuals. The Somerset case was a landmark legal decision in England that had significant implications for the institution of slavery in the British Kingdom. The case centered around James Somerset, an enslaved man from the American colonies, and Charles Stewart, his enslaver who purchased him in the colony of Virginia. Stewart later brought Somerset to England in 1769. In 1771, Somerset escaped, but was eventually recaptured and put on a ship bound for Jamaica, where he was to be sold into slavery. However, Somerset's supporters, including abolitionists like Granville Sharp, challenged his detention through a writ of habeas corpus, arguing that English law did not recognize slavery and that Somerset could not be forcibly removed from the country. The case was heard in the Court of King's Bench by Lord Chief Justice William Mansfield, who elevated the matter to the 12 judges procedure, a powerful legal mechanism that convened all 4 justices of the King's Bench, alongside the 8 judges from the Court of Common Pleas and the Exchequer. This tribunal was reserved for cases of profound legal significance, tasked with establishing controlling precedents, interpreting statutes, standardizing evidentiary rules, and resolving judicial disagreements. After exhaustive arguments, the tribunal ruled unanimously in 1772 that James Somerset could not be forcibly removed from England and sold into slavery. In its landmark decision, the court declared that slavery was so odious that it could only be sustained by explicit legal authority, an authority that did not exist in English common law. This ruling not only shattered the legal foundation of slavery within Britain, but also set a precedent that reverberated throughout the kingdom, exposing the moral and legal shortcomings of colonial bondage. This landmark decision was, in effect, England's Emancipation Proclamation of all enslaved blacks in the American colonies in 1772. Brilliantly orchestrated by Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, the unanimous ruling of Britain's highest tribunal, the 12 judges procedure in Somerset versus Stuart, delivered a decisive legal blow to slavery across the British Empire, including the 13 American colonies. The court held that slavery could only be sustained in the kingdom by explicit legal authority, an authority that did not exist in English common law. Slavery could not be an authorized practice based on a colonial American slave law or statute. None of the 13 American colonies could prove or facially establish its slave laws being explicitly sanctioned by a legitimate legal authority due to parliamentary sovereignty. Further, by affirming Somerset's right to habeas corpus relief under the British Magna Carta, 1215, and his fundamental due process rights under Parliament's English Bill of Rights, 1689, the Somerset ruling judicially abolished all colonial slave codes, Negro laws, and hereditary slave ordinances. In law, black colonials were free Englishmen. Yet, widespread graft and corruption within colonial governments enabled slaveholders to defy the ruling, falsely asserting that Somerset was not binding in the American colonies, an assertion that was both legally indefensible and historically fraudulent. This argument was ahistorical and legally unsound. Historians Leonard W. Levy and Kenneth L. Karst, in the Encyclopedia of the American Constitution, confirmed that Somerset became the rule of law in the United States because the precedent had become part of American common law. The claim that Somerset was irrelevant to the 13 American colonies became even more indefensible once America's Congress adopted Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence and English law in July 1776, despite Thomas Jefferson's vocal warnings against it. To deny Somerset's legal force was to ignore history and reject the very legal foundations upon which the new republic was built. Afrofuturistic narratives contemplate that they cannot stand upon the barren claim that the Somerset decision was irrelevant concerning the 13 American colonies, and we can assume that the 13 American colonies were subject and controlled by the Somerset decision. The Somerset ruling was unquestionably binding on the 13 American colonies. Decisions of the King's Bench, especially those adjudicated through the 12 judges procedure, carried the full force of law over the British Privy Council, the highest appellate authority governing colonial courts and assemblies. This tribunal's rulings were not open to interpretation. They were controlling legal precedents that colonial governments were obligated to follow. Afrofuturism cuts through the web of lies, half-truths, and revisionist distortions embedded in America's historiography. It empowers historians, academics, and policymakers to navigate the deliberate obfuscations of the past, exposing historical realities that have been buried or manipulated. by reclaiming the legal and political truths suppressed by colonial and post-colonial narratives. Afrofuturism drives the pursuit of historical justice and reconciliation. By early 1782, America's treasury was depleted, and France had withdrawn its military support, leaving the fledgling nation on the brink of financial collapse and potential disunion. In a desperate bid for peace, the Continental Congress appointed Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and Henry Laurens to negotiate terms for peace with England in Paris, France. However, Jefferson did not depart in time to participate, leaving the remaining 4 delegates to navigate a significant obstacle: slavery. A key point of contention was Britain's commitment to Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence in English law, particularly General Henry Clinton's Philipsburg Proclamation, 1779, which granted freedom to enslaved black individuals in the 13 American colonies. Despite this tension, Britain and the United States reached a preliminary peace agreement on November 30, 1782, with one of its 10 articles mandating the release of all prisoners of war on both sides. However, once news of the treaty spread, members of America's founding generation began orchestrating the widespread kidnapping and re-enslavement of black colonials across the 13 American states, violating the truce with Britain. In response, British General Guy Carleton confronted General George Washington in May 1783, formally protesting these kidnappings as renewed hostilities. Washington, however, dismissed Carleton's objections, insisting that Americans were merely reclaiming their rightful property. Carleton forcefully countered, arguing that these individuals were not property, but free British subjects under English law, and therefore must be released under the terms of the peace treaty. Washington, unwavering, falsely asserted that colonial slave codes and Negro laws still defined them as the rightful property of U.S. citizens. Washington's stance was legally indefensible. The American Colonies Act of 1766 had already abolished colonial slave codes and Negro laws, recognizing them as a direct challenge to Parliament's supreme legislative authority for all purposes whatsoever. This legislation made it clear that colonial governments had no independent power to enforce slavery outside of British law. Furthermore, upon declaring independence, the United States inherited Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence and English legal precedents, affirming Parliament's authority over colonial statutes. The Somerset Decision, 1772, had already nullified colonial American slave codes, establishing a powerful legal precedent that was directly referenced in the Declaration of Independence's grievances against the Crown. Thus, the legal foundation of American slavery was built on contradictions and defiance of existing British legal standards, making its continuation after 1776 not only a moral atrocity, but a violation of the very legal principles the revolutionaries claimed to uphold. Ironically, Jefferson, a slaveholder, founding father, and principal author of the Declaration of Independence, contemplated American slavery as an Afrofuturist to the extent he recognized and wrote about the destructive and corrosive force of slavery on the civic fabric of the United States. In his 1785 work notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson described slavery as an institution of despotism, a brutal system that degraded both the enslaved and the enslavers. He acknowledged that it fostered a culture of tyranny, depriving black individuals of their humanity and legal rights, while morally corrupting the slaveholding class. For Jefferson, slavery was not just a stain on American ideals, but a fundamental contradiction to the very principles of democracy and justice upon which the new nation was founded. Jefferson's assertion that slavery was a form of despotism, a term historically associated with autocratic rule and totalitarian oppression, was provocative and prescient. He understood that slavery had an extra-legal origin and was acutely aware of the fact that the British imperial government abolished colonial American slave codes, Negro laws, and all hereditary slave ordinances within the 13 colonies through the American Colonies Act of 1766, because they denied and questioned Parliament's supreme legislative authority for all purposes whatsoever during British colonial rule. Importantly, Jefferson was convinced that Congress mangled his vision for a slavocracy in 1776, and he harbored this resentment throughout his life. Given that Congress conceded in the Declaration's grievances that the British had abolished our most valuable laws, and then formally adopted English legal precedent, Jefferson's argument that slavery undermined America's core ideals of equality and rule of law becomes even more significant and earnest. Furthermore, Jefferson understood England's highest court's ruling in the Somerset case affirmed parliamentary sovereignty and declared slavery was not allowed and approved by the law of the kingdom in 1772, 4 years before the Declaration of Independence struck down colonial slave practices. And yet, over his passionate urgings, America's first Congress and all 13 state legislatures formally adopted Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence and English law. Jefferson's Afrofuturistic narrative envisioned rebellion, as he famously wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation, is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference." Jefferson's prophetic words foreshadowed the Civil War and the catastrophic consequences of the founding generation's decision to enslave 500,000 legally free black Englishmen, denying them fundamental due process of law and embedding within the American psyche the false claim of racial superiority, and that the United States was preordained to be a white nation where black individuals were mere chattel. This lie has proven durable, mutating into the toxic ideology of white supremacy and the myth of American exceptionalism, twisting the nation's founding ideals into instruments of oppression. Jefferson's frustration over this fact was evident in that he forever lamented that America's first Congress mangled the Declaration of Independence, as they included Parliament's abolition of colonial slave codes and Negro laws as one of their 27 grievances held against the British Crown. This acknowledgement in Jefferson's Lamentations supports an Afrofuturistic narrative that the 500,000 black colonials living in colonial America should not have become the cornerstone of America's slave-based economy after Congress signed the Treaty of Paris of 1783 and exposes the emergence of white supremacy and racial discrimination in America as flawed ideological constructs designed to justify and conceal unlawful racial subjugation of legally free people. Historians Paul Finkelman and Henry Wiencheck have challenged Jefferson's legacy, arguing that his rhetoric on slavery did not translate into meaningful action. In Slavery and the Founders, Race and Liberty in the Age of Jefferson, Finkelman contends that Jefferson prioritized his wealth and political ambitions over abolition, using moral rhetoric as a facade. Similarly, Wiencheck, in Master of the Mountain, Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves, argues that Jefferson consciously exploited enslaved labor for financial gain while maintaining the illusion of moral conflict. Yet these learned critics and others are assuming slavery's legality under the English rule of law. They do not consider the fact that America was facing an internal threat and the possibility of disunification over this question in 1785. Jefferson questioned slavery's legality in real time and proffered his views as an Afrofuturistic thinker. A central question in Afrofuturistic legal speculation is the quest to address historical wrongs, which are particularly more personal for the descendants of foundational Black Americans. And this is a reasoned and necessary concern, since many Afrofuturistic narratives extends beyond correcting American history and appears in alternative forms of restitution, reparations, and this also includes the creation of autonomous Black societies time travel-based justice, and financial compensation for historical wrongs. Afrofuturism is more than a genre. It is a radical act of legal and political reimagination. It dismantles the legitimacy of oppressive legal systems, challenges the historical narratives that justified Black subjugation, and constructs alternative futures where justice is not granted but inherent. By reinterpreting history, envisioning political systems untainted by colonial corruption, and crafting speculative models of governance, Afrofuturism reclaims agency over the past, present, and future.